Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week, we've got another of our summer minisodes, wherein we take a closer look at one broad topic in the world of classical music. Our focus today will be on teachers and teaching. But first, we'd like to start with our prelude segment, and once again, our official, unofficial intern, Joseph Foz, is with us. So Joey, what do we have today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, aka Stump the Hosts.
And now Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And this game is especially fraught for our hosts, since none of them know what they're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. Your hosts make no guarantee that they'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing their thought processes will elucidate something about how they listen to music, and provide some entertaining musical banter. So that none of them can see the submissions, I'm once again here to officiate unofficially. This week we've got a themed round for you all. Up top I'm going to tell you that every composer you're about to hear is Russian.
That's great. And let's just be clear. A theme does not count as a hint.
A theme does not count.
Theme is the framing. We still get our hint when we need it. If we need it. I mean, but of course we probably won't even need it. We so rarely do.
You sound like the person at the grocery store that counts all the coupons, and you're just like, I just want to remind you that this does not count as this coupon, but I have this coupon to get this discount.
I don't think I've ever encountered that kind of person, Kensho. Maybe that's you're talking
person?
About. Yeah.
At the grocery store that holds the lines up?
No, I'm more the person who I like to police people's number of items in the in the express.
Just about to say, yeah. I know which person Will is.
Even more, what I like to do is I like to police the grammar of the sign that says that, so that it doesn't say
10 items or fewer.
10 items or less. It says 10 items or fewer. Yeah, exactly. It's one of my hobbies.
You're a monster.
Today's first submission comes from listener Ian. Here it is.
Well, we hear folky, kind of strophic, with some. I mean, if we had heard this without the hint that it was Russian, we would have ended up in Russia, right?
Oh, for sure.
I think that's.
Yeah.
For me, this is speaking like Lyudov.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's funny this because it definitely has a little bit of that hint of Eastern exoticism that's so popular in late 19th, early 20th century Russian writing.
Yeah.
But it had a little bit of even on top of that, I felt like there was a little bit of the Prokofiev wrong noteness. Mm-hmm. So Tiff, if you say that that's Lyudov, I will go with you on that because I don't really know.
It's not inventive enough for Prokofiev. There would have been a left turn into some weird key at some point in that, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. But this is probably too earthy for Borodin.
Yeah, not kind of romantic enough in language, right?
Yeah, this is a little bit more modernist, foot stomping. I mean, I would have guessed that this is a ballet.
Could be, yeah.
Okay, Lyudov is a good guess. Is this too early to be Soviet? Where would we put this? I would put this in the 1890 to 1910, or is that?
No, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Glazunov, should we throw him in there just for kicks?
Sure,
yeah.
And is there a third that we want to land on? Arensky? He's earlier.
Yeah, I think Arensky is really, blue blood romantic.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right. Yeah. What about Glier?
Oh, okay,
Glier,
yeah.
that's the one
that's
that
good.
I was thinking.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right, Joseph. Lyudov, Glazunov, Glier.
Not quite. This is by the composer Mikhail Gnesin, a Russian Jewish composer. This is the polka from his suite of incidental music called The Jewish Orchestra at the Ball of Nothingtown.
Jewish orchestra at the ball.
From 1929.
Oh, okay. So we're not quite there.
Gnessen?
Yeah, how do you spell Gnessen?
Either Gnessin or with one S.
Oh, okay. Well, that's we count that as a listener recommendation, I think, more than anything. So, and I will listen to that. Thank you, listener Ian.
Today's second submission comes from listener Emily. Here it is.
Now this framing is turning into like a weird sort of anti-hint, because I would have to guess that this is some Russian person who came over and wrote Hollywood film scores. It just sounds so much like that to me. But of course, there were Soviet film scores too. So,
Right.
But I would put this like 1950, 60, maybe 40s, 40 to 60, something like that. Yeah, but this sounded very lush. And certainly more modern than the last one. I mean, I feel like we should throw in some like Soviet era splashy mid 20th century composer, but I wouldn't know who. I mean, there's no way this is Khachaturian or Kabalevsky.
Yeah, it's a little old school for all of them.
Yeah. Well, Tiff, do you think that this is earlier than what I'm guessing?
I mean, I could see a world in which this was like more. I mean, like the build up and like the whole. It was a little Tchaikovskyan. I'm not saying it's Tchaikovsky, but
Yeah.
Definitely influence from there, even from like the ballets and stuff like that, right? So,
Well, do you want to put Glazunov in this basket?
Maybe.
I'm going to say Dmitry Tyomkin.
sure.
I'm going to jump in with the hint for this month's submission. Today, I'm moving in reverse chronological order with these submissions.
What?
So we are
This is
going wrong.
earlier than
Wow.
The
Interesting.
date on the Gnessen was 1929.
Huh. Okay. Well, I'm way off. Well, I think we got to go with Glazunov because I don't know who else.
Yeah.
God, I want this to be Dmitry Tyomkin so badly, though. But
Me too, Will. Me too.
yeah, thank you. All right, who else?
Does Glier go here?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's just do the same. Let's do Lyadov, Glazunov,
Keep
Glier.
the same
Let's
basket
just
for
keep
all.
the same
It's
basket for all
not
of them.
Lyadov. Does Borodin get there?
This sounds too much to me. This sounds more modern to me than apparently it is. So,
Get out of that headspace,
but
man.
Borodin was Borodin. I still have to think that this is after the 1900 dividing line into the 20th century, and I don't think Borodin lived that long.
Okay.
But hey, Tiff, if you have a Borodin feeling, far be it from
I
me.
don't have any feelings. I'm just throwing out names that are earlier than.
Let's put Glazunov,
1920.
Glier, Borodin. That's our new basket, Joseph.
Count it. This is Glazunov. This is from the second act of his opera Raimonda, which was actually premiered in 1898.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well. Okay. I wasn't quite on it again. Thank you, listener Emily. That's a
It's a nice one.
it's another nice one. Yeah.
I enjoyed that.
Today's last submission comes from listener JT. Here it is.
Solo piano, sort of a waltzish thing.
This is one where if we didn't know that the composer was Russian, we might have been thrown.
Yeah, would have gone like Polish or something.
Chopinization or something like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's good thinking.
I don't know how that helps us, but
So Miaskovsky?
Miaskovsky. I think Miaskovsky is later. Miaskovsky is a 20th century composer,
okay.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, this could be like one of the Tchaikovsky The Seasons pieces, but it doesn't sound very Tchaikovsky-ish. I threw Glinka in there. I mean, I don't really know what any of Glinka's music sounds like outside of the Ruslan and Lyudmila overture, but I don't see why this couldn't be Glinka.
Yeah, I see that.
What about, you know who we should have guessed along the way is Ippolitov Ivanov. I can never remember that guy's name, but I think he might be later. Like, we should have guessed him for this number 2 guess rather than this one. What about Lyudov, Tiffany?
Possible. I mean, Lyudov always has some of that. I mean, I associate him with precisely that kind of weird harmony, like the folk harmony kind of, Bartokish kind of color. And this doesn't have a trace of that, but I'm not saying that he couldn't have written it. I don't know.
I mean, this could be Borodin, but again, it's like I expect a little bit more spice in the incense there, with Borodin. The Polish route is, I think, Kensho, you have an interesting point there. Like,
What about, like, Rimsky or, like, Balakirev?
Oh, Balakirev. Let's put him in there. I like that. Balakirev, Glinka, and just for kicks, Ippolitov Ivanov.
How about Kui? Who the hell knows anything by Kui?
César Kui. Oh, yeah. I think I've guessed him several times on a Name That Tune. César Kui. Again, I think he falls a little bit more in that Borodin camp.
Okay, yeah. I'm just basically thinking of all the members of the 5 that I actually remember.
Yeah. Well, I think that they were all a little bit more Russian than this. All right, Joseph, is it any of those people?
So close. This actually is Borodin.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I totally,
Hilarious.
I let the side down. I'm so sorry, guys.
This is the first mazurka from his Petite Suite for piano, 1885. So all the Polish thinking was absolutely correct.
And we weren't going that far back. I mean, I think we got a little bit it was a very helpful hint, Joey. It was a great hint, but we thought we must have been going like a couple decades back or something with each step.
Well, in spite of Joey's immense helpful framing and hints and leading us there, we weren't able to get this one. So, listeners, you got us again.
No, you got 1 out of 3. You got Glazunov.
Yeah, but that doesn't count as a win.
Okay, got it. Well, that just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we move on, we'd like to remind our listeners that these listener-generated Name That Tune rounds are a regular feature of the show. So as ever, we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for your hosts to try to identify.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
You're very welcome.
And with that, we move on to our discussion topic for the day. So, Tiffany, what are we talking about?
Today's Minisode discussion topic is teachers and teaching. We've devoted a number of segments on the GabFest to the world of music education, and not without reason. Classical music requires a rigorous, specialized training that lasts for several years, or really a lifetime. The formal education of classical instrumentalists and singers often starts before a child learns to read and lasts well into their 20s or 30s, should they choose to pursue postgraduate studies, as many do. Teachers in the classical music world tend to form special bonds with their students far beyond what would be expected of a classroom instructor in an academic subject. This is due in part to the intensity and frequency that music instruction requires, but it also has to do with the substance of the music itself. The deeply felt, personal, embodied nature of the art form creates a link between student and teacher that few other disciplines seem able to do. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility, and unfortunately, student-teacher relationships can turn toxic or even abusive in a variety of ways, some of which we've covered on this podcast. But at their best, music teachers have the power to change lives for the better, whether as private teachers, chamber coaches, conductors, academic instructors, or that catch-all term, mentors. We all shared one very influential teacher, Michael Jinbo, who passed away recently, and I'm sure we'll get to him in the course of our conversation, but let's start with some other teachers we've worked with. Will, when you think of, teachers that were particularly impactful in your life, other than Michael, who comes to mind?
The people who I think immediately of are my high school orchestra and choir directors and my college orchestra and choir directors. And I think the person that I'm going to focus on right now is my college orchestra instructor, a lady named Barbara Schubert, who, boy, what can you say about Barbara? I mean, very intense. A lot of people found her extremely intimidating, and she was, and still is, I assume. Very detail-oriented and the kind of person who knows that if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. Has a very unorthodox podium presence. And
this is also who you referenced in our closed discussion last episode, right?
I did talk about her in the closed conversation. Yeah, it's true. So anyway, I think that my big takeaway from Barbara is how hard she worked on everything, on every aspect of making that orchestra work. And to the point where you really had to say, like, if it weren't for her, the thing would not have come together. Now, I mean, was she a little over the top? Yeah, for sure. I mean, she would bind all of our orchestra music in, comb bindings, and she would personally use a paper cutter and slice off a 1/4-inch sliver off the bottoms of the pages so that, you had cardboard covers for the parts, and then the actual pages that you would turn would have
I feel like I understand you so much better now.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, for sure. They would have a 1/4-inch missing so that when you turn the page, they would not scrape the music stand, and so they would make for more quiet page turns. Wow. So she, I always thought that she was insane, but then how many concerts have I been where some, meaningful rest is totally ruined by the fact that you hear, as the page turns. So, I mean, that's just one of many examples of her insane work drive. I mean, she would, if the rental materials for a piece of music were an old photocopied manuscript or something, she would typeset them a whole Vaughan Williams symphony. She would typeset in Finale so that the materials would be better. So, I mean, just that element of dealing with the actual physical properties, and understanding that what a musician reads is one of the most important things. And her commitment to that level of detail and preparation is something that I very much took away. And that was a lesson that, I just learned by example. It wasn't something that she told me, that she taught me. What about you guys? So who are some influential teachers in your guys' lives?
I want to talk about 3 people very briefly because I think that it kind of shows the difference in the styles of teaching that I've experienced in my life. So first of all, my violin teacher from basically middle school through high school is a woman by the name of Ann Setzer. And not only was she my violin teacher, but she really saw me through my awkward formative years in high school. So I think she became kind of a friend or a sounding board for just the stuff that was going on in my life as well. So this is kind of where what Tiffany was referring to in terms of the blurring of the teacher student relationship, where I remember very much was at a summer camp for the first time, and there were a bunch of older kids that were known to sneak out of the dorm and go smoke. And I remember her sitting me down in the lesson and being smoking is bad, don't smoke. Had this talk with me, very much like a parent, but also not, you know what I mean? It's an interesting relationship that one has with that. So I'm still close to her to this day. And now it's more of a friendship than any kind of teacher-student relationship. But she was very much involved in my life outside of music when I was growing up. And then I think about also my violin teacher at Yale, who was Shoko Aki, she literally is, I think, Yoda incarnate in terms of how she taught. So she's famous for when you after you play something for her in a lesson, there will be this loaded 1 minute of silence before she would say anything. And then what she would say would be a one-liner your third finger on your right hand is the spirit guide of your bow. I should not this is what she would say in lessons. And you just sit there being what do I do with that information? And yet 2 months later, I'll be practicing and I'm oh, I get it now. So she had this really kind of jarring way of teaching that I studied with for 5 years. So I started, you get used to it and you start to kind of be able to, you almost have to learn how to interpret all those things and teach yourself, which I think maybe is the goal with her. And then finally, I think about Otto Werner Mueller. We've talked about a little bit on this podcast, or my conducting teacher, Curtis, who was very much the old school, like break you down where you feel like you don't know anything and then build you from the ground up again. So that was a very trying experience, because whereas we talk about that as being old school or almost like the way things are done in our field, I felt like it was the first time that I was experiencing this at an older age. I was like 22 at that time. So this is not the style that I was used to at all. Like I'd never had a teacher like that. So it took me a while to get used to. But he, in a way, was also very much like Barbara.
Oh, I bet he wasn't, but explain why.
Well, in the way of like, he would actually go in and like edit every single part of an orchestra thing. If there's a rest that didn't make sense, like he would also like rebar rhythm. So he was famous for like rebarring all of Schumann 3 to
for hemiolas or something,
to write out the hemiolas.
Oh wow, interesting.
And it would drive the orchestra insane, because it's actually really hard to read that way.
Yeah.
But he really insisted on this. And I have, like, when he retired, he left me like a couple of sets of parts that he like doctored himself. He would also create his own rehearsal figures. I mean, just the meticulousness, which he was like really intervening in all of the rehearsal process, because for him, it was all about saving time and like being efficient and all of this. And so I learned a lot from, I guess I'm not a very like obsessive compulsive person, but I became one just from like the attention to detail that I think he instilled in me, which was really great. But yeah, that process was difficult, I have to say. So three very different styles of teaching that I think about a lot, because now that I'm starting to teach myself, like I kind of have to pick which route to go in my own experience.
What about you, Tiff?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to share this as conductors, which is the fact that we all come from an instrumental background. And so, of course, if I think, back far enough, yeah, my first violin teacher was my mom. Obviously, that was a very formative relationship for 10 plus years. I mean, a lot of parent student teacher relationships don't last that long. So I can't tell you what the secret sauce was. Maybe that I was, I mean, I think my mom had a good combination of being hands-on and hands-off is actually, I think, where that comes from, is like she didn't get too invested in the idea of me becoming successful even in any way on the violin. So, but that's obviously the earliest one I can remember. And then I think of, if I fast forward to like conducting days, I was like a baby conductor, like not even a conductor, somebody who had thought about conducting more closely. And I audited a workshop where Carl St. Clair was teaching. And I will not go so far as to call Carl St. Clair one of my teachers, but he was the first teacher who I felt gave me the time of day in a field that I felt was full of lots of people who would not do that. So even though I was just like some schmuck auditor who like didn't have anything to offer and only had, suspicions and dreams, he was able to carve time out of the schedule on that masterclass, not for me to conduct an orchestra, but just to have time. I mean, there's a picture that I have from me in a room with him and a piano, and he's like fixing the position of my wrist, and that I would say was a pivotal day for me. I mean, there was lessons about posture and about standing but I don't remember anything specific. I only remember the feeling. So that's something that a teacher really has the power to influence. It's not really often, when you zoom out enough, it's not about technical lessons. It's about the way they taught you and the environment that was created in the room. And of course, with most relationships, now this is an exception, with most relationships that are worthwhile, that gets created over the course of years, like you said. And it's not that I'm trying to like highlight any kind of one pivotal moment, because I think sometimes people get invested in like stories, right? Like singular moments that changed your life. It's usually not about that. It's usually about like a long slog, and you don't appreciate the cumulative effect of it until years later, just like both of you have acknowledged. So I think, even though that was a snapshot in a very long story, it was the beginning of something that I think is still important to me, which is just like creating the time of day for your student. But Kensho, you started to get us into what's happening now that we're the ones teaching. So let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I obviously have dipped my toe into academia, but I don't think it's the same classroom teaching, obviously, at all, when talking about private instruction or even masterclass instruction with conducting, right? I mean, it's really a different track that your mind is on. So can you think of a recent experience or maybe an early experience teaching, and like where is a snapshot into the mind of either of you, really, when as we're becoming the teachers?
This has just been something that's been on my mind as I usually teach kind of privately, or I do like video review with like younger conductors and stuff like that. I've had a few negative experiences, I'm sure, as many, I think both of you have had probably in these like kind of masterclass situations or like lab worker situations where the conductor comes in and basically makes it all about them. So they'll come in and just be like, well, just do it the way that I do it. Like, watch me do it, and then just do the same thing. And so like, I absolutely detest that to a very high degree. But I guess what I'm realizing is that there is a certain element to that is helpful depending on the level of the student.
Mm-hmm.
In that, I think I had a bad experience because at that point I didn't necessarily need someone to tell me exactly what to do, but like, and this is what was really refreshing when I started studying with Yannick, was he was always like, okay, what do you want to do here? How can I help you get that? And so, I very much subscribe to that idea, much more so. So then what I realized when I was working with some students is that that approach doesn't necessarily work if the student actually needs a little bit more direct guidance as to what to do. And so I started to realize that was my mistake sometimes, of being like, oh, okay, what do you want to do? Like, let me help you do it, because I don't want to impose my ideas on them. But then at the same time, I was like, oh, maybe I do need to do a little bit of that so that they actually have some kind of framework and a foundation to build off of. And I think maybe there is a way to kind of do that while not restricting their own freedom to kind of make their own choices as well, I guess. So this has kind of been something on my mind as I start teaching a little bit more, because I don't do it that often.
Yeah, I mean, when I started my career right out of college, I was the conductor of a very small neighborhood youth orchestra program. And boy, I had to jump in and just pound down fundamentals for these kids. I mean, just the very basics of intonation, rhythm, meter, pulse, stuff like that. And I mean, Kensho, I understand you're saying that you don't want to like dictate, but as you also say, at a basic level, you've got to instill those fundamental musical values. I mean, that's like the most important. And in a way, as much as we want to talk about the poetic nature of our interpretation, yada, 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 so much of music instruction is just refinement of your fundamentals over and over and over again. I think there's a famous quote by, I think it was Pablo Casals, who was teaching a student and who had made like a lot of progress and got to like, a new sort of plateau. And he said, okay, that's great. You've arrived at a new level. The bad news is that now everything you know is wrong, which of course is not exactly how it works, but in a way it is, right? Because now it's like you have to push to the next level. So I think that's a big thing about teaching, is that like, you have to understand where somebody is, what their potential is, and push. You have to, I mean, it's a carrot and a stick, right? I mean, you have to push them along the way, and you have to sort of compel them to push themselves. You have to guide them along the way. And that's what I strive for in my teaching.
Well, it's interesting that the first teaching experience that you mentioned here is one where you were teaching an orchestra. And that's a dynamic that we haven't really talked about before. I mean, all the teachers that we brought up were people who mentored us in a private way. What about it teaching orchestras or groups of people is really, I mean, there's something different dynamically that goes on there, right? Like, what do you guys think about the value of group instruction, or the difference in mentality when you're instructing a group versus a single person?
Well, my teacher example actually wasn't a private teacher for me, Barbara. I mean, I learned from her in the context of being in her orchestra. And, I never had private instrumental instruction. So all of my learning has come in a group context. I mean, starting from when I was an elementary school student learning the viola, being taught by a saxophone player, which probably explains a lot about my abilities as a violist. But no, I mean, I think that if you're really paying attention, you can learn a lot from a group instructor. But actually you have to be like the right kind of person. I mean, most people who I was in, group violin, viola, string lessons with in elementary school are not like, making music today. I don't think so. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about it, Tiffany?
The distinction that comes to mind right now for me is actually the one that I've been dealing with in my academic life, which is like classroom instruction versus my orchestra instruction. And as a conductor, you end up doing more of the group thing. But this is the complaint over and over again from music students and non-music students alike, which is that like it's kind of hard to get into the group thing, right? I mean, you don't feel like it's tailored to your actual responses. Like you feel like maybe the conductor's always talking to like that section over there, and it's just like you're just sitting there waiting for somebody to direct some comment your way. And so that there's a sort of diffusion of instruction that happens at the group level, which is true. I mean, think of like Suzuki group violin lessons. I mean, it's such a common way to start people off, but when you're thinking about something as detail oriented as how to play a string instrument, it's just like you can't possibly set somebody up completely well if all they're doing is Suzuki group lessons. You cannot do it. And so it's something I think about a lot, and something that I tend to end up talking about a lot in like job interviews of like, can you create a group experience that feels as if everybody in the room is learning? And that's really hard. I mean, the only person that I'd ever really seen do that successfully was Michael.
Yeah, but I will say that I think that even if a group teacher can't give you that level of technical detail that each person needs, they can be the person who like inspires you.
Yes, it's
they can
certainly
totally
not saying anything about that being worth doing.
Right?
Or
no.
I mean, like it is essential because the act of being in a room and making music together is essential to the mission statement.
No, and Michael was amazing at that, and maybe we should talk a little bit about that. I mean, like he was on top of everybody's individual part. He could have something to say. He could have a piece of guidance. He could stop everything in the middle of rehearsal to work with like a flute player on, this one passage, and yet not lose sight of everything else that was going on. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, people think of the Monta School as a conducting camp, but the full name of the festival is the Monta Festival for Conductors and Orchestral Musicians, or the Monta School, for conductors and orchestral musicians. And it truly was that. And now that we're in this kind of period of transition, like my only hope is that we will continue to be that and not just be one of these other conductor camps, with 15 conductors running around and an orchestra that feels like hired goons. Like that is really important, that it continues to be a true education for literally everybody in the room, from piano conductor over there who couldn't care less about, what the double basses are doing, to like section trumpet player who has had a couple professional experiences under their belt. And they all raved. Every brass player to come through Monta in the last 10 years raves about Michael's ability to teach to them.
Well, that's also at the very essence of the festival, and that the conductors also have to play in the orchestra. I found like I was learning so much because I also could be called out as an instrumentalist. It's not just because I was a conductor that would be called out. Like as an instrumentalist, I could be called out too. So, I mean, I think that you just get better in all phases of just music, and I think that obviously for conductors is super important. That it's not just about conducting; it's so much more than that. So, I mean, for someone to be able to, like Tiffany said, like really feel like everyone is learning in that room to make that kind of an environment happen, that's a real skill and a talent for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about, great teachers who influenced our lives, but as I mentioned in the introduction, there are also ways in which a teacher-student relationship can go sour pretty quickly. So, I mean, without trying to dish too hard, maybe let's dig into that a little bit. Do you guys have any experiences that come to mind?
Well, I mean, I just referenced a general kind of trend of some teachers that kind of come in and say, well, let me just show you how you do it, and you replicate it. And I think that's also very much a danger in conducting. Also, I think there are also these people that are like prodigies or like savants at their craft. And then so they haven't needed to kind of go back and examine what is it mechanically, what is the process, all of that kind of like self-reflection to kind of examine what, like, how you can explain to a student how to do it. And so I think, I just hear stories, especially from like brass players, especially because I think that what goes on with the embouchure and the muscles in your face and all of this can be quite intricate. So you need someone to be able to kind of explain that. Yet if someone's just so naturally gifted that they're just like, well, I don't know, it's easy, just do it this way, which is something that I think you hear a lot in teachers sometimes. If they're like very great, like really amazing players, but just you happen to find a teaching position somewhere and they have to kind of figure out how to talk to students, and it's just like doesn't compute, right? So I think those are the general kind of bad teacher examples that I can think of.
Yeah, because teaching is not delivering information. You are working with a human being. And so like it's not enough that you're talented at whatever information it is that you're delivering. You have to actually, make some effort to understand people. And the people who are very good at this are not always the ones that you might think. I mean, I think sometimes with Michael, for example, sometimes we might have seen some instances where I think people felt that he was being doctrinaire or, rule adherent or kind of hardline about some things. And then they felt like, well, he's not seeing me. And it's like, that was never actually what was going on. He was assessing at every moment what this person needed in order to move forward. And it was not a sense of, you are not doing what I want, so I'm not going to teach you. It always was coming from a teacher's place. And it's interesting that can sometimes get confused, either on the teacher or the student's side, frankly, because sometimes teachers think that, what's wrong with you? I am telling you what to do. Like, why don't you just do it? What about you, Will?
Yeah, well, okay, so one funny thing that came to mind from Kensho's story about like for teachers who have this natural ability and then that means that they haven't thought about it, haven't analyzed it. It made me think of my teacher, David Efron at Indiana University, who has amazing ears, has perfect pitch, and there was one morning where one of his doctoral candidates who had been gone from the program for a while had just like completed his dissertation and had it bound and everything. And, David was like one of the signatories on it. And it was all about ear training for conductors. And I guess that David had just gone to his mailbox. And so the student had sent him, his bound copy of the ear training for conductors. And he came up to our class and it was a little bit beforehand. And he just looks at me and goes, "Here, do you want this?" And I was like, what? It's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't think, either you can hear it or you can't. Why do people bother with this? Here you go. I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And in a sense, he has a point. It's like either you can hear a wrong note or you can't, but like you can also train your ears, and you don't have to have perfect pitch.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, that was that was pretty funny. No, my defining like bad teacher toxic relationship was with my college composition teacher, Easley Blackwood, who really saw me as a chance to get a disciple, wanted me to hang on his every word. He had a great store of knowledge to give, but he gave it pretty quickly, and he did not have much insight to offer beyond that. His main thing that he wanted me to get from him was he wanted to turn me into a conservative Republican like he was. And he would take me out for dinner all the time and like go on these long discourses about which states were good and which were bad. And the good ones were the ones that had Republican legislatures and the bad ones were, the blue states. And it was just endless like this. And he just wanted me to hang on every word on this. And I was hoping that he would tell me stories about like when the Chicago Symphony premiered his pieces and like what it was like working with Schulte and stuff. And he had no interest in talking about that. So that went on for many years, and it was not good. It was a total waste of my time. And finally, I had to just cut things off with it. I mean, I broke ties with him very definitively. And that was the smartest move I ever made. It was a really good decision in my life process. What about you, Tiff?
I've been lucky enough to get along with most of the teachers that I've ever had. I mean, I think that that's, I'm not going to call that an unequivocal strength because I kind of wish in my life that I had like, at some points I had the strength of character or something to like really butt heads with people. And that's just not really who I am. But for better or for worse, I'm a good student, in the most Asian stereotype way you can think of. But what I have noticed a lot in observing conductors teach, and sometimes in general, I'm able to escape the wrath of whatever happens in a bad master class or whatever. But like I'm watching how the dynamics between various students and teachers change all the time, and it does feel as if these days students themselves also need to take more responsibility for their own learning. Because when you get an environment like what we have right now, which is that education is sold as a commodity and that students have to pay through the nose for it, then you enter into a degree program expecting to get something, some tangible reward. And if that's not a salary, then it better as heck be like everyday dispensation of knowledge in exactly the way that we've been saying is not the healthiest way to teach. So that's another trend. I mean, because, as long as we're talking about bad teachers, we may as well also talk about bad students, which, when you enter into this transactional relationship with a person who is still just a person, okay, they're just somebody else trying to figure out a puzzle. And like, yes, they are in a position of responsibility. Yes, they do have power and all the dynamics that implies. But at the end of the day, you are the one with control over what goes on and how open you are to learning. And it sounds very reality TV cliche to say it, but it's like either if you're not winning, you're learning. And every experience is one where you have to sit back for a second afterwards, not for very long, but just to say, okay, so what was going on here and how can I take responsibility for it, instead of what went wrong here and how it was all somebody else's fault and I was unlucky and I was and somebody else wronged me. So as long as I'm on this kind of border, this is something I'm going to be thinking a lot about, because that's, I mean, like it or not, that responsibility is actually also something that teachers have to teach now. That is the world we live in. So anyway, this is a rich topic and one we could talk about for a long, long time, but we generally like to do that through specific examples here on the GabFest, but it's worth zooming out every once in a while and getting a little philosophical about it. So let us know who your most influential teachers were, listeners. Let's go to Will for our classical mixtape today.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. And I have a feeling that we might be continuing the theme of teachers and teaching. So, Kensho, what do you have for us?
Oh, yeah, certainly. So I mentioned Shoko Aki, my teacher, violin teacher at Yale, and she, for a long time, was the concertmaster of the Saito Kinan Orchestra, which is this Japanese all-star orchestra that Seiji Ozawa put together back, I think, 30 years ago or so now. And so this is a great recording of the Brahms Fourth Symphony with Seiji Ozawa and the Saito Kinan Orchestra. You can see her sitting a second chair violin in this video.
Excellent choice, as always, Kensho. We know that Brahms is always welcome on the classical mixtape, and that's a great connection there. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
I have a little piece that I stumbled across doing kind of programming exercises. This is a piece by Christine Donkin. It's the third movement of a suite of four. It's a little chamber orchestra suite, and this one is called Frosted Pane, like the pane of a window. It's a suite that's based on the poetry of Charles G.D. Roberts, who is a Canadian poet.
Very interesting. Great selection. Glad to know about this piece. All right, for my mixtape selection, I am bringing Glazunov's Symphony No. 2 in F sharp minor. And, it sounds like a totally random thing to bring. It's a nice piece. But this connects to a Barbara Schubert story, which is, we played this in University of Chicago Orchestra. And we got to the coda of the last movement, and there's a key change. And she goes, well, the problem with a symphony in F sharp minor is that it's going to end in F sharp major. So good luck. And I just remember thinking like, oh yeah, right, that's probably going to be a problem. And she was right. We sounded like shit. I mean, I'm sure that we missed E sharps all over the place, probably added a bunch of B sharps that had no business being there. But I just that was one just little mindset thing that was like, oh yeah, as a conductor, you should pay attention to what key things are in because it's going to make it harder for the orchestra to play. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this mini-sode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.